Hey, once again, I'd like to welcome back Mike Billington from LarouchePAC. Hello, Mike. How are things in Washington?
Actually, quite good, and glad to be back.
So, what's going on?
Well, I wouldn't say in Washington, I'd say in New York, Manhattan, which is the center of the universe right now for good reasons. Things are in general in the world looking up much more than they were even 2 or 3 weeks ago, since Vladimir Putin effectively flanked President Obama's war plans and has Obama and his British backers, Wall Street backers, very much on the run.
What?
So go ahead.
Yeah, sorry. So, I was just going to say that seems pretty clear because over the last week or so, suddenly the refugee agenda dropped off the media. We started looking at Ukraine again, and really the media and the politicians in Britain, at least, don't seem really to know which is the best way for them to move their policies forward, and that seems to be as a result of Putin's intervention here.
Yeah, well, uh, the the refugee crisis had a significant role in this because I think much of Europe woke up to the reality of what has been self-apparent for a very long time, which is that the perpetual war policy carried out by Bush and Cheney, continued by Obama, massively supported by Cameron, that and his predecessors, Tony Blair, of course, who launched several of these wars, that this process has finally come home to roost to the Europeans, who, like most Americans, believed that this murderous, genocidal policy of our president and his predecessor was okay because it somehow was over there. Our younger generation has grown up with perpetual warfare going on at all times, at the same time that we're living through a absolute degenerate culture where their so-called entertainment is nothing but murderous perversity and ugly noise called music, which has engendered an entire youth culture of complete obliviousness, if that's a word, to the reality of what's going on in the world, which is the global financial breakdown crisis, which is sweeping Europe and the United States, and the perpetual murderous warfare and a president who glories in his narcissistic love of killing. So, what happened with the refugee crisis is that the Europeans at least began to wake up to this. And there was a very, very dramatic shift in Germany when Angela Merkel made the profound announcement that she was going to welcome virtually all the refugees who came in. And this really sent a shock. Uh, it came at the same time that German industry and many of the key German leaders had succeeded in making it clear that the sanctions against Russia were insane, that they were destroying Germany and much of Europe, that they had little to do, in fact, with destroying Russia, but in fact were an attack on Europe. And the Europeans began to wake up to the idea that under Obama, with Cameron leading the way, we were on the brink of yet another war in Europe, in their homeland, and this time in an era of thermonuclear weapons, as Mr. Obama is rapidly moving new, refurnished tactical nuclear weapons into Europe. So this has sparked a wake up. And Putin, for his part, when he saw, especially when he saw the U.S. begin using Incirlik Air Base in Turkey, talking about setting up a no-fly zone in Syria, they have a very clear memory of what happened in Libya when, under the guise of setting up a no-fly zone to protect innocent civilians, Obama and his British allies, or controllers, I should say, uh, effectively got the Chinese and the Russians to abstain on a vote for setting up a no-fly zone in Libya, on the promise that this was indeed just a no-fly zone. And then it very rapidly became clear that this was a cover for an outright regime change, vast, mass, murderous bombing, the public snuffing out of the life of Libya's leader Gaddafi on international video. Uh, this and the turning over of Libya to warring terrorist factions. So when Putin saw that trying to use the same methods to get a full-scale assault going in Syria, they basically said, okay, that's it. The Obama administration claims it's fighting against ISIS, so be it. We're going to also fight against ISIS, only we're going to really fight against ISIS. And they began deploying their military. They now have US or Su-24, 25, and Su-30s on the ground at the air base in in Syria. They are preparing for military operations, but more importantly, Putin is on his way to New York. He'll be here this weekend and speak on Monday at the UN, and he has made it known publicly, both himself and through Foreign Minister Lavrov, that he will be presenting there a proposal which will have the collaboration not only of the Assad government, which of course Obama still continues to say Assad must go, despite the fact that the Assad army is the only army capable of actually defeating ISIS. But not only Assad, but also the countries in the region. General President Assisi from Egypt was in Moscow. King Abdullah from Jordan was in Moscow. Even the Saudis were brought into Moscow to discuss what's going on. And Bibi Netanyahu was in Moscow because it's clear that if there is Soviet air action over Syria, that they're going to make sure that what they call deconflict with the Israeli Air Force, who flies rather freely over Syria, illegally, of course. And they are having deconfliction discussions with Kerry and Lavrov over U.S. Air power over Syria. So
sorry, Mike. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. But how much of Putin's action do you think has come as a recognition that ISIS, in fact, is effectively the West's tame terrorist organization?
Oh, very much. I mean, this is calling the bluff of the Obama administration that, in fact, they're not fighting ISIS. The bombing raids against the ISIS forces have done some damage to the oil industry, for instance. They say, well, we're taking away ISIS' ability to use the oil industry to finance themselves and so forth. But they've been relatively pinpricks. And more importantly, both the Patriot missiles in Turkey and the U.S. air flights over Syria for bombing raids has kept the Syrian Air Force and Army away, because Syria knows that if they get into a conflict with the U.S., the U.S. would use that as an excuse for a full-scale invasion. So, therefore, it's served as a no-fly zone, effectively, in the sense that they kept the Syrian army and air force away. Now, if Russia is there collaborating, then in fact they can really go after ISIS. And I'll point out, you've probably reported on your show, Mike, several times, the former head of our own defense intelligence agency, General Michael Flynn, who was fired by Obama last year. In 2013, when Obama almost started a full-scale war on Syria over the phony chemical weapons issue, that war, which he had actually on a Friday evening had given the order to start the bombing on Monday. And the next morning, General Martin Dempsey, the head of our Joint Chiefs, went to the White House and basically told Obama, if you go in there, you're going in support of al-Qaeda and the terrorist networks, and you had better get the congressional support or else. And this was right after your parliament, under Jeremy Corbyn's leadership, as I understand it, had voted against Cameron's effort to go to war in Syria. And then that helped influence our Congress and our own mobilization of the LaRouche forces here to hound the Congress, stopped that war in 2013. Now, it turns out that General Dempsey had been acting on the brief by his Defense Intelligence Agency chief, General Michael Flynn. Michael Flynn, last month, went public with the fact that his report at the time had not only shown that any invasion of Syria would lead rapidly to what he called an Islamic caliphate in Syria and Iraq, precisely what ISIS is, and that Obama's continued actions in Syria did in fact lead, and not only in Syria, but of course his murderous campaign across the Middle East, his drone killings and so forth, led to the creation of exactly that Islamic Caliphate under the ISIS or ISIL. And more importantly, Flynn announced last month that it was not accidental. When asked by the Al Jazeera reporter, you mean that Obama's actions were inadvertently helping to create ISIS? General Flynn, the head of our Defense Intelligence Agency, said, no, this was not inadvertent. This was willful. The policy of the Obama White House was to support al-Qaeda operations in order to bring down the secular regimes in the Middle East, which of course started with the takedown of Saddam Hussein, went on to the destruction and murder of Gaddafi, and was aimed at the takedown of Assad. So that is now exposed. It's public. Putin has taken advantage of this to show that Obama is both a fool and a dangerous, murderous narcissist. Of course, Putin doesn't say this, but we do, and the truth is he has to be removed. He has to be removed before the election, when you have this clown show on the Republican side of people who can't wait to get in another dozen wars around the world. So this is a very pregnant moment, a tremendously powerful moment where truly universal and revolutionary changes can and must take place, centered in what's happening at the UN over this coming week.
I mean, do you think that what's happened in the UK with the whole Corbyn business, and also what's happened more recently this week with the scandal surrounding David Cameron, is a reflection of this mood that there is at the moment?
Yeah, sure, absolutely. Big gate.
Yeah.
Yeah, no question. I mean, I think the revolutionary fervor, really, and it is, around the election of Jeremy Corbyn, is a reflection of the deep-seated hatred of everything that Tony Blair represented. His wars, his economic policy, his turning the UK, you could say back, but it wasn't really back, continuing the Maggie Thatcher monetarist policies that have ripped the UK economy apart as they have in the United States, under Bush, under Cheney, under Obama. That the takedown of the Glass-Steagall bill here in the United States back in the late 90s, which led to this massive speculative bubble under the Bush administrations and under Obama, the quantitative easing fanaticism. And I would add that it's extremely important that you look at the fact that the rise of the BRICS, not just the rise of China, but the rise of China in alliance with Russia, with India, with South America, with Ibero-America, Latin America, through this BRICS process, the demonstration that these nations have established their own strength and power adequate to say we no longer have to obey the dictates of the IMF and the World Bank. We no longer have to accept the so-called Washington Consensus, which says we don't build infrastructure. We only preach about human rights and environmentalism and make you pay your debts, and we will lend you money, but the money is only to refinance debts and adds on to the debts, as is happening for many, many years in the developing sector and is now happening in places like Greece and Portugal and Ireland and so forth. But the BRICS are, in fact, building nations. They're doing what America used to be proud of, which is that they are building infrastructure all over, building true partner nations. They need the raw materials just as the imperial powers of Europe and the US did in the past. But they're paying for it, not with debt, not with money, but with infrastructure, railroads, high-speed railroads, water projects, nuclear power plants, collaboration on space. This is a new paradigm based on peace through development, which is historically identified with what was called the American system, but which, of course, America has long since deserted, especially since the death of Roosevelt and the assassination of John Kennedy. And we've adopted the British model of monetarism, of the control over our economy by private banking interests, to the point where those now completely bankrupt banks throughout Europe and the United States, loaded up with $2 quadrillion worth of worthless derivative paper, extracting the debt payment from the blood and bones of human beings, shutting down infrastructure, shutting down industry, shutting down any kind of development. This genocidal self-destruction, coupled with the genocidal perpetual war policy, has reached a point where there is no middle ground. It's going to be either America and Europe join with this new paradigm, the BRICS paradigm, through imposing Glass-Steagall, shutting down these Wall Street banks, or we are going to be in a war which will be thermonuclear. And Obama is a madman. He's not going to make a deal with Putin. The danger is that he will, in this next week, especially when Putin arrives here, simply go berserk and do something to launch this war, which, as I've said, could very quickly become global and thermonuclear.
I mean, this may be too big a question to answer in the time we've got, but you know, it used to be, if we go back only 100 years, that people in Britain, I'm sure it was the same in the United States, welcomed the railways coming to their local communities because they understood the economy of that, and that has changed, particularly in the last 40 years. I mean, how has that come about in your view?
Well, this is the green disease. You know, the essence of fascist thinking is the destruction of the love of being a human being, which means the love of creativity, which means the love of discovering the laws of nature and applying those laws through machine tools, through scientific discoveries, applying those laws to the increase in the standard of living, the productivity of the population as a whole. This is what human beings do as opposed to animals. They look at the future, they look at the laws of the universe, they discover those laws, and then apply them to transforming the way the human race lives through technology, through infrastructure. The green disease, this environmentalist hell, the so-called climate control or climate change, global warming freaks, based on this massive hoax, comes directly from the fascist movements in the pre-World War II period, centered in London. The eugenics movement, the Aldous Huxleys, the various networks around Bertrand Russell's circles.
The Prince Philip circles.
The Prince Philip circles, Prince Philip and Prince Bernard, who founded the World Wildlife Fund after World War II, were doing this using environmentalism and conservationism and so forth to basically rebuild the eugenics movement from the pre-war, which was pure race science. It was that, you know, the white race is superior, the lesser races have to be controlled or eliminated. As Bertrand Russell said, war has been unsuccessful in reducing the world's population. Perhaps a Black Death sweeping the world every now and then would make things more pleasant for the rest of us. This kind of genocidal mentality, which was behind the eugenics race science movement, was discredited in World War II because their friend Adolf Hitler used it and it became exposed for what it was. So they launched this green ideology. We just released in New York yesterday, and it's sort of the kickoff for this Manhattan-centered mobilization to transform civilization. We held a press conference. I'm going to hold up the report that we released. It's an EIR special report called Global Warming Scare is Population Reduction, not Science. And it goes through both the entire history of Prince Philip, of his friend Schellenhuber, who unfortunately was recruited by Pope Francis to write this despicable encyclical, which we call an encyclical from hell, which ironically puts the Catholic Church on the side of population control. I think it's inadvertent or foolish on the side of the Pope. But the author of this, Schellenhuber, who's a knight of one of these knights in the UK, and an advisor to Merkel in Germany, who oversaw the shutdown of the nuclear industry in Germany, that he has publicly advocated that the world cannot contain more than 1 billion people. that this is the carrying capacity of the earth. And this is the continuation of this fascist genocidal idea. That's why we call it green fascism.
So that brings me on to this, because Pope Francis has just arrived in the United States for, well, you can tell me more about what he intends to do there, but clearly this is a core, this subject is a core of his visit. And this Daily Mirror article here, typical British media, but nonetheless, as flippant as it is, they are really pointing out that he has jumped on the austerity bandwagon and the global warming bandwagon, and this seems to be a core part of his visit this week.
Yeah, no, it is. It's unfortunate. He hasn't been bad on economic issues. He's taken on the Wall Street mentality somewhat, but he has been completely pulled in to this green fascism, and it's a real problem. I mean, we don't hold back from identifying the fact that this encyclical has to be repudiated, that the author of the encyclical has to be identified, not so much as Francis, who bought into it, but as Schellenhuber and Prince Philip's cohort, Martin Palmer, who has been involved in this. Martin Palmer, this complete nature freak type, who again advocates population reduction, the destruction of science and technology. This is the root of this. By the way, I encourage people to go to our website, LarouchePub.com, LarouchePub.com, and this report is advertised quite prominently. It's $25. You can get a copy either online or in a physical copy. Get it circulated. We're going to have these in the hands of the UN mission representatives who have been drawn to a conference this weekend, the 25th to the 27th, I believe, at the UN, where the Pope will speak, and which is promoting this global warming hoax, the reduction of carbon, meaning the destruction of industry and the destruction of progress for the world, and especially for the what they call the COP21, the big global warming conference going to be held in France at the end of in Paris at the end of November. So they hope at that time to do what they failed to do in Copenhagen in 2009, which was that the Indians and the Chinese, when they were told you have to pledge a reduction of carbon emissions, which they knew meant stopping their industrial development, and they just said no, we're not going to do it. And this time, the hope by Mr. Stern, you're Mr. Stern, who heads this thing, and others who hope they can force China and India to go along, we have to make sure they do not, and that the rest of the developing sector nations and the entire world recognize that this global warming hoax, this carbon hoax, goes hand in hand with the decision by the Western financial interests that they cannot tolerate the rise of BRICS, which threatens their power, and that they're willing, in fact, anxious to go to war. So these are all one issue. This is an existential question for the human race, which could very well be transformed over this next 2 weeks by what takes place in Manhattan, where we have concentrated all of our forces, and we call on the world to join us in concentrating these forces to make this UN General Assembly a historic transformation away from this degenerate, anti-human imperial cult and towards joining with the BRICS in what can and must be a new paradigm for global development.
Okay, well, look, what I'd like to do, if I may, is just bring up the issue of the United Nations, because obviously a lot of this this agenda is being played out through the United Nations, and not only the Paris meeting that you mentioned, but also their new sustainable development goals, and this whole sustainability issue is part and parcel of this. And I wanted to sort of just raise this issue of the Chinese Foreign Affairs Ministry statement on this, because they've made a statement because it's the 70th anniversary of the UN Charter, and they're saying it's important to build a new type of international relations featuring win-win cooperation and a community of common destiny. It also calls for greater democracy and the rule of law in international relations. The 70th anniversary of the UN is an important opportunity for the international community to review history, uphold the outcome of the world's anti-fascist war, and look ahead to the future, so as to turn the vision of the UN Charter into reality at an early date. And they go on to say the United Nations is an outcome of victory against fascism and embodies the hope for peace and development. The United Nations has been the most representative and authoritative intergovernmental organization ever, and accomplished a great deal over the past 7 decades. And then they go on to say 70 years on, the UN Charter remains as relevant as ever. And so many people, I would suggest to you, would say, well, in the reality of the United Nations hasn't quite fulfilled whatever it was set up to do, and so what is it going to take to get the United Nations to behave in a positive way?
Well, the United Nations has always been two things. Its original design by Franklin Roosevelt, who unfortunately died before it was completed, and John Foster Dulles, the Wall Street lawyer and British asset in the U.S., had a hand in undermining the complete picture that Roosevelt intended. But they could not stop his very brilliant idea of a Security Council, which included Russia and China. So it had the character of this anti-fascist coalition between the United States, Russia, and China at the core of it. Now, I don't have to go through. Everybody knows how it's been perverted, how it's been used, how it's been manipulated, and so forth. But it still represents a meeting place of the world's nations. Of course, the Anglo-American faction is going to try to use it to impose this green fascism. The intention was to rail against Russia, calling Russia and China the aggressors. You know that Russia is the aggressor because of what's happening in Ukraine. China is the aggressor because of what's happening in the South China Sea. Now, of course, I think it's pretty clear to the world who the aggressors are in the world today. But the point is, as that statement, a very powerful statement, and I'm glad the Foreign Ministry put that out, identifying this as the 70th anniversary of the defeat of fascism. And I'm sure you and many of your viewers watched this historic parade on the celebration of the 70th anniversary of the end of World War II in Beijing, which Putin helped organize, and which Putin and Xi Jinping stood proudly, along with Park Geun-hye, by the way, from South Korea, which I think was extremely important, that the Koreans chose at that point to reject the U.S. idea of a U.S., Japan, Korea alliance against China. And Park Geun-hye not only rejected that, didn't reject alliance with the U.S., but rejected this alliance against China by joining with China and Russia at this parade, a powerful display of their military, and then coming into the United Nations and identifying it, as that statement you just read says, as the 70th anniversary of the defeat of fascism. Now, that can't be missed by anybody. We now know there's the rise of fascism in Eastern Europe, what's happening in Ukraine, you know, your audience knows, is a U.S., British funded rise of the neo-Nazis, the Stefan Bandera, Hitler's ally in Ukraine, the followers of Stefan Bandera, who are now desperately trying to override the effort of the so-called Minsk Agreement, which is France, Germany, Russia, and the Kiev government, where the Kiev government was basically forced to acknowledge that they had to go along with the European and Russian policy of stopping this threat of war in Ukraine, which would not be in Ukraine, it would be global. So the right wing, the Nazi networks there, who are actually leading the fight on the ground through the right sector and the Azov Brigade and so forth, are desperately trying to keep that war going. That's what's being stirred up right now. But in any case, this is a situation in which the general global sense of what's taking place worldwide has shifted very, very dramatically. And that's why at the UN, the fact that you do have the world's nations coming together, you have an opportunity to use this forum in the way in which FDR originally intended to be used, which is to bring about peace through development.
Okay, so this meeting this week, aside from Pope Francis's address, what is the main focus of that going to be? Is it mainly the environmental issue, or is there more going on there?
Well, it will be, because he's going to be at the UN at this 3-day sustainability conference, which is, as I said, intended to lead into the Paris conference, which they hope will be a declaration of mandatory limits on growth. This is a showdown. But I think the point here is not to rail against the Pope per se, but as we have in this special report, and again, I encourage everybody to get it. It's $25. You can get it. You should get it. Read the history, but also read the science. In other words, there's a lot of people who have attacked global warming as a hoax, but it's important to recognize that it's a cover for this depopulation, genocidal policy. It's not just bad science. It's a political thrust at global depopulation. And that, in fact, there is a science to the climate, which we also cover in great depth in here, which has to do with the galactic, not only solar system, but galactic influences on the weather, which actually affect the changes in climate. People have to know the real science in order to refute the bad science. And as far as the Pope's role, the point is to identify the author of this encyclical, the Schellenhuber, Martin Palmer, Prince Philip apparatus, which can and must be destroyed. And in terms of your original question on Piggate, I think there's no question in the UK that there's a recognition that Obama's downfall, which is now in the process, and the danger of a new war in Europe. All of these things have come together to create not only the Corbyn phenomenon, but the open attacks against the monarchy, and the question of whether a modern state playing a role in the world should be governed in a monarchical fashion. These issues are real. They have to do with not just what's happening within your country, but the role that the UK can and must play internationally in this new paradigm, a paradigm of global development. So I think all of Europe is being shaken up in a very powerful and significant manner. And people have to be focused on the fact that this is a moment, a rare moment of opportunity in which we can make universal changes in history to the benefit of mankind. Or, if we fail, that if we miss this window of opportunity, we could very well be in a global thermonuclear war, a war of extinction, which could be upon us very, very rapidly, much more rapidly than most people wish to imagine. Because just today, you can read in the news, Obama is sending a large number of reformulated tactical nuclear weapons into Europe, into Germany, even though they'd agreed not to have these nuclear weapons in Germany. They're preparing for war. They're building bases along the Russian border. The Russians are holding exercises, very much aware that this is a threat to their country. So we are on the brink of war, and people have to think of this as a unified concept of what's taking place for humanity as a whole, both the economic collapse of the Western economy, the threat of war, and this new paradigm, which can and must be realized on a global scale.
I think that's probably a very good place to end for today. Thank you very much for joining us, Mike. Just remind everybody how they can read more of the stuff that you're doing.
It's our website is LarouchePub.com, and a second one is LarouchePAC, PAC for Political Action Committee, LarouchePAC.com. We have a petition on there on LarouchePAC, one to call on the U.S. and Europe to stop the geopolitical confrontation with Russia and to join with the BRICS in global development. And a second one simply identifying the extreme near-term danger of World War III and calling for an end to that war. I call on people to go to that, sign those petitions, to buy a copy of the report. We also have, on the back of that report, is the ad for our 370-page report called The New Silk Road Becomes the World Land Bridge. It's a program for the development of the entire world: Africa, South America, Asia, the United States, through this land bridge or Silk Road idea on a global scale, focused on science, technology, fusion power, nuclear technology, space research, and the economic policies centered around the Glass-Steagall fight to restore that kind of development-oriented financial system, which was once known as the American system. So I encourage you to go to buy those reports if you can. We need those circulated. We need the resources, and it would be very useful for you to sign those petitions, and we can get in touch with you if you do. So very, very glad to be here. Thanks a lot, Mike.
Brilliant. Thank you.